Last time we saw Paul instructing his Philippian friends that whatever happens, they are to live in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Philippi was a Roman colony, and the Christians in Philippi were surrounded by those who would call Caesar Lord. But, says Paul, you are to live in a way to show that your Lord is not Caesar, but Jesus. Unlike following Caesar, having Jesus as Lord does not mean just following his commands. As we've seen before, to be a Christian means to be brought into a living relationship by Jesus. In verse 1, Paul describes this as being united with Christ. It's as if Jesus, through his death and resurrection, has called us to walk with him, to live the life that we were made for. And today's verses give us a further glimpse into this life. In verse 5, Paul writes, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ." So here's an introduction to relationships done the Jesus way. Paul emphasises two hallmarks of these kind of relationships. The first is that they'll be categorised by humility. Like the other Bible writers, Paul knew that Jesus' story didn't begin in a manger in Bethlehem. He knew that the Son was there before the very creation of the world. In fact, it was through him that everything was created. In verse 6, Paul says, "He was by very nature God." He could obtain no higher status. Humans have a poor track record when it comes to using status and privilege for the good of others. But not Jesus, not our God. All power and honour are his. Yet Paul writes, he became nothing by taking the nature of a servant. The one who by very nature was God became by very nature a servant, truly a servant. The servant God's nature is to serve. To do this, he had to become a human. The Son of God became like us in every way. He exchanged the presence of the Father for the grubby backstreets of first century Palestine, the creation of stars for carpentry. Yet so great was his commitment to serve us that that's just the beginning. Paul says that he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Jesus wasn't cornered into the cross. He humbled himself. So great was his willingness to obey the Father that he gave himself up for us, always aware of the cost. Romans considered crucifixion to be so degrading they reserved it for enemies of the state. Jews considered those crucified to be so pitiful they were said to be under the curse of God. Yet this is where Jesus heads resolutely. His life of obedience meant that he deserved only blessing, and yet for us he takes God's curse. Why? Because he is a God of humility. He is the God who says, "You first." We can be tempted to think that we will just obey God. But when we're made to look stupid, or we feel uncomfortable, or we feel like we're missing out, we draw lines around our obedience. But Jesus draws no such lines. He never appeals to his rights. And instead, for us, he limitlessly obeys the will of the Father. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ. Paul uses this phrase to call us to have a mindset towards one another of you first. Always aware that whatever the cost for us, it will never cost us as much as it cost him. In verse 9 to 11, Paul describes a second hallmark of these relationships: releasing your reputation to God. In verse 9, Paul emphasises that Jesus' limitless obedience and humility means that he's been exalted by God to the highest place and been given the name above every name. But what does that mean? When someone is said to have cleared their name, it's about honour, it's about reputation. So Paul's logic is this: Jesus' limitless humility and obedience demonstrates to us that there is no one more worthy of a name of honour than him, and so God has given him the name above every other name. That last phrase echoes Old Testament language used to describe the honour owing to the Lord God. By using this language, Paul is not saying that Jesus is promoted to some sort of higher godness. That's impossible. Instead, he is saying that God will ensure that Jesus' humility and obedience will one day be plain for all to see. And on that day, even those who once scorned him will come to realise that to relate to him, you have to put the honour owing to God. Every knee will bow before Jesus, even powerful enemies like Caesar and those who oppose him today. God the Father will ensure that Jesus receives the honour due his name. Remember, Paul is encouraging the believers in Philippi to have the same mindset as Christ. So what about us? Paul knows that committing to the path of Christ in humility and obedience will mean that others will scorn us. But Paul encourages us that we know where the story is heading. There will come a day when the unseen, unappreciated acts will be known and will be seen. He's committed to doing that for Christ. And as those united with Christ, he'll do that for us too. And on that day, we'll conclude that everything we did, every act of sacrifice, every time we put others before ourselves, it was more worth it than we could possibly imagine.